The Vaelric estate had once occupied a position of genuine consequence on the Nine Realms continent's political map, a fact that had become, over the 3 generations since its cultivation talent began its slow and irreversible decline, a source of quiet grief rather than pride for everyone who still lived within its walls. The decline had not happened suddenly. It never did, in clans built on cultivation talent rather than territory or trade, because a clan standing in the world the strong ruled and the weak obeyed rested entirely on the bloodline strength its heirs produced generation after generation, and bloodline strength was not a resource that could be purchased, negotiated for, or protected through political alliance once it began to fade. The Vaelric clan's founding ancestors had carried bloodlines strong enough to hold territory against rival clans twice their size. Their descendants, for generations later, had watched that strength thin with each successive bloodline awakening rite, weaker talents producing weaker children, until the clan standing among the Nine Realms continent's cultivation hierarchy had settled into the specific, humiliating position of a house everyone remembered as formerly significant. Kael Vaelric had grown up entirely inside that memory rather than inside any version of the clan's actual former glory, which meant he had grown up understanding his family's decline not as a story that had happened to other people in another time, but as the specific, present condition of every room he stood in, every elder's face that turned toward him with careful, restrained hope whenever the subject of the coming bloodline rite arose in conversation. He was 17. The rite would determine, publicly and permanently, what kind of cultivation talent he carried, and by extension, whether the Vaelric clan's 3-generation decline would finally find its floor in him, or whether it would continue past him into whatever diminished future awaited a clan that had exhausted its last plausible hope. He understood the weight of that expectation with a clarity that had never once curdled into resentment, because resentment required believing the expectation was unfair, and Kael did not believe that. He was the last direct heir of his generation. Someone had to carry the hope forward, if the hope was going to be carried at all, and the fact that circumstance had made him the one carrying it did not strike him as an injustice so much as a simple, unavoidable arithmetic of birth order and family fortune. The morning of the rite arrived clear and unseasonably still, the kind of weather the older clan's servants described, half-jokingly, as the sky holding its breath, and Kael dressed in the ceremonial robes his mother had prepared for him with the same careful attention she gave to everything connected to the clan's dwindling dignity, robes cut in the traditional Vaelric pattern that had once signified a house of genuine standing and now, worn by him, signified mostly the memory of standing rather than its current reality. The rite itself was held at the Sanctum of First Bloodlines, a shared ceremonial ground maintained jointly by the region's cultivation clans, ancient enough that its stone foundations predated any of the current ruling house's historical records, its central bloodstone a relic whose origin nobody living could fully explain, only trust, because it had never once produced a false reading in the centuries of use the Nine Realms continent's clans had put it through. Rival clan heirs occupied the ceremonial ground in numbers that made the Vaelric contingent, small as it had become, feel smaller still by comparison. Kael recognized several of them from prior gatherings, heirs of clans whose own bloodline strength had continued climbing steadily across the same generations the Vaelric line had spent declining, young cultivators who wore their confidence the way people wore something they had never once been required to question, and who regarded the Vaelric party with the specific, unhurried contempt of people who no longer considered a rival significant enough to actively mock. That absence of active mockery bothered Kael more than open hostility would have. Hostility implied a rival worth confronting. What the other clans extended toward the Vaelric name now was something closer to a courteous, distant awareness that a formerly relevant house still technically existed, the way a person might acknowledge an old building slated eventually for demolition. Not with cruelty, simply with the settled certainty that its future required no further consideration from anyone outside it. His mother stood beside him in the waiting line, her expression arranged into the careful neutrality she'd perfected across years of these ceremonies, though Kael had learned to read the tension beneath it the way he read most things in his family, quietly and without comment. His grandfather, the clan current elder, stood a short distance away in conversation with 2 of the clan remaining senior cultivators, their voices too low to carry but their postures unmistakably braced for an outcome none of them expected to be good. Nobody in the Vaelric party said aloud what everyone privately understood. That the rite today was less a ceremony of hope than a formality whose outcome would simply confirm, in the most public and permanent way the Nine Realms continent institutions offered, whatever quiet consensus about the clan future had already settled into every observer mind. The rite proceeded through the ceremonial order the ancient tradition required, each clan's heirs called forward in sequence determined by an ordering system based on founding date rather than current standing, a detail that placed the Vaelric name relatively early in the proceedings despite the clan's diminished present circumstances, an irony Kael noted without allowing it to shape his expression as his name was finally called. He walked to the bloodstone. The stone itself was smaller than its reputation suggested, a rounded, unremarkable surface of pale gray mineral that had, across centuries of ceremonial use, developed a faint permanent luminescence from the countless bloodline readings it had produced, a quiet inner light that pulsed gently even before any hand touched it, as though the stone itself were breathing in anticipation of what it was about to reveal. Kael placed his palm against its surface. The stone's reaction, when it came, arrived without the dramatic flare that accompanied a strong bloodline awakening, the kind of brilliant color surge that had greeted several of the rival heirs called before him, gold and crimson and deep sapphire light blazing outward to the audience's appreciative murmurs. What rose from the stone beneath Kael's palm was a dim, ashen-gray glow, faint and unsteady, the specific color the Nine Realms continent's cultivation hierarchy had assigned, generations ago, to the lowest possible classification a bloodline reading could produce. Broken bloodline. The ceremonial official reading the stone's output confirmed the classification allowed in the same measured, professional tone used for every reading regardless of outcome, a tone that made no distinction between triumph and disaster because the official's role was simply to report what the stone showed, not to soften or dramatize it. Bloodline classification, broken, the official said. Registered. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. Kael understood this immediately, standing there with his palm still resting against the stone's fading gray light, because shock required an outcome nobody had anticipated, and this outcome was the one every observer on the ceremonial ground had already quietly settled into expecting from a Vaelric heir before he'd even touched the stone. The rival clan heirs did not laugh. Several of them did not even look at him directly, their attention already sliding past the moment toward whatever came next in the ceremony's schedule, the specific, deflating courtesy of an audience that had confirmed what it already believed and found nothing in the confirmation worth further attention. Had allowed herself to carry into this morning had just been extinguished as completely and as permanently as the stone's ashen light was now fading back into inert gray stillness. His grandfather said nothing at all. He simply inclined his head, the same formal acknowledgement the tradition required of every clan elder regardless of the reading's outcome, and Kael understood, watching that careful, controlled gesture, that his grandfather had already begun, internally, recalculating what the Vaelric clan's future looked like now that its last plausible hope had confirmed, publicly and irreversibly, that no hope had ever actually been there. He returned to his place in the Vaelric party's formation once the ceremonial official moved on to the next heir, and stood through the remainder of the rite's proceedings with the specific stillness of someone determined not to give the watching ceremonial ground anything further to observe, absorbing the quiet, courteous pity that radiated toward his family's small formation for the rest of the morning, a pity considerably harder to stand inside than mockery would have been, because pity did not require anyone to believe you might eventually prove them wrong. The journey back to the Vaelric estate passed in a silence nobody in the traveling party seemed willing to break, and Kael spent most of it looking out at the passing countryside rather than at any of his family's careful, composed faces, turning the morning over in his mind with the same patient, methodical attention he brought to most things, not yet grieving the outcome so much as simply trying to understand its exact shape and weight before deciding what, if anything, could be done with it. He did not believe, walking back into the estate's familiar halls that evening, that anything could be done with it. Broken bloodline was not a classification that improved with effort or training. It was, by every account he'd ever read in the clan's own archives, a permanent sealing, the cultivation equivalent of a door confirmed shut rather than merely difficult to open. He retired to his quarters earlier than usual that night, declining the quiet, careful sympathy his mother offered at his door with a gentleness that made the sympathy harder to bear rather than easier, and sat alone in the dark for a long while after she left, forearm resting against his knee, staring at nothing in particular, turning the morning's ashen gray light over in his memory the way a person turned over a wound to check, again and again, whether it had actually stopped hurting yet. It was well past midnight, in the specific stillness that settled over the estate once even the latest working servants had finally gone to their own quarters, that Kael became aware of something he had not felt before, a faint, unfamiliar pressure gathering somewhere beneath his own skin, centered, he realized slowly as he sat up straighter in the dark, in the same place his palm had rested against the bloodstone that morning. He held his hand up in front of him, though there was nothing visible to see in the darkened room, and felt the pressure sharpen into something closer to a presence, an awareness settling into the edge of his perception. A faint light bloomed into existence at the very edge of his vision, not from any external source in the room but from somewhere behind his own eyes, a soft, pale luminescence resolving slowly into shapes he understood, after a startled moment, to be characters, text, arranged in a clean and deliberate structure that no scroll or enchanted tome he had ever encountered had produced. He read it once, disbelieving, and then again, more carefully, because the words did not shift or fade the second time the way a trick of exhausted eyes might have produced and then abandoned. Bloodline type, Devourer. Status, dormant. Function, Guardian Directive, online. Objective, guide host to First Realm contact. He sat very still in the dark, forearms still raised, staring at words that made no immediate sense against anything he had ever been taught about bloodlines, cultivation, or the ceremonial classification that had, only hours earlier, confirmed in front of an entire gathering of rival clans that whatever he carried inside him was broken beyond any meaningful use. Guardian Directive did not sound broken. Devourer did not sound like a classification anyone would call broken by accident. He read the words a third time, waiting for them to resolve into some more familiar and disappointing meaning, and when they did not, he found himself sitting in the quiet dark of his family's declining estate with the specific, careful, disbelieving stillness of someone who understood, with a clarity that felt almost dangerous to trust, that whatever had happened to him at the sanctum of First Bloodlines that morning was not what the ceremonial official had announced to the watching world at all. The rift the origin blessing directed him to lay 3 hours' ride from the Vaelric estate's outer boundary, in a stretch of broken hill country the clan's maps marked only with an old warning glyph and a note, generations faded, describing the ground as unstable and unworth cultivating. Kael left before dawn, telling the stable hand only that he intended a long ride to clear his thoughts after the rite, a claim close enough to true that it required no further elaboration, and rode alone into hill country his family had avoided as a matter of inherited habit rather than active knowledge. The system guided him with a precision that unsettled him more than comforted him, its directions arriving as calm, bloodless bursts of text at the edge of his vision, bear northeast past the fractured ridge, the rift's instability weakens near midday, approach from the lower slope to avoid detection by anything already nesting near the tear, information delivered with the specific, unhurried confidence of something that had clearly done this before, or been built by something that had. "What are you?" Kael asked it quietly, aloud, alone on the empty hillside, because asking a system that had no evident method of speaking back still felt more honest than simply following its instructions without acknowledgement. Guardian Directive. Function, guide host through realm contact and early bloodline integration. Full historical designation restricted pending host stability confirmation. It was not an answer so much as the shape of one, and Kael understood, reading it, that whatever the system actually was, it had been built to reveal itself carefully, in stages, rather than all at once, a design choice that told him something about whoever had built it, centuries ago, and what they had expected a host in his position to be able to handle. The rift itself, when he finally reached it in the lower slope's shadow, looked unremarkable in exactly the way the old warning glyph had suggested it might, a narrow tear in the visible air no wider than a doorway, its edges shimmering with a faint, sickly discoloration that marked it clearly as something other than ordinary space. The system had explained, on the ride out, what lay beyond such tiers in careful, functional terms. Realm rifts as thin points where the boundary between the mortal cultivation world and the other realms had worn dangerously close, permitting occasional passage for beasts strong enough to force their way through and, for a prepared cultivator, deliberate entry in the other direction. He stepped through before the caution accumulating in his chest could talk him out of it. The beast realm's air struck him first, thicker and warmer than the mortal world's, carrying a faint metallic taste that the system identified, unprompted, as residual mana density far exceeding typical mortal realm concentrations. The terrain beyond the tier was a broken, ember-scarred landscape, cracked earth glowing faintly at its deepest fissures, and it took less than 100 paces before Kael understood exactly why his clan's old maps had marked this rift as worth avoiding rather than exploring. The Emberfang beast found him before the system's warning text finished rendering. It was smaller than the ancient bestiaries described its kind, young by whatever measure governed beast maturity in this realm, but its aura alone staggered him, a wave of heat and hostile pressure that dropped him instinctively into a defensive crouch before conscious thought caught up with reflex. It moved faster than anything he had trained against in the mortal world's sparring grounds, orange-red light trailing from its jaws in short, controlled bursts that scorched the cracked earth wherever they landed, and Kael spent the first several exchanges doing nothing more sophisticated than staying alive, his cultivation technique, modest, unremarkable, exactly what a broken bloodline was expected to produce. Proving barely adequate to avoid each successive strike rather than answer any of them that he was losing before he fully understood the fight had a shape at all, driven backward across cracked, glowing ground toward a fissure the system flagged, with clinical urgency, as a fall hazard exceeding survivable threshold, and it was in the narrow margin between that warning and the beast's next committed strike that something in him. Not calculation, not the system's guidance, simply the raw, desperate refusal of a body that had decided dying here was unacceptable, drove his blade forward into the one gap the beast's aggressive posture had left open. The strike landed cleaner than anything he had produced in the entire fight before it, driving deep beneath the beast's foreleg into something vital, and as it staggered, shrieking, collapsing into the cracked earth it had scorched moments before, Kael felt the origin blessing ignite fully for the first time, a sensation unlike anything the quiet, patient text at the edge of his vision had prepared him for. A pulling, drawing warmth that gathered beneath his skin and settled, permanently, into something that felt less like new information and more like a limb he hadn't known was missing suddenly restored. Realm assimilation, complete. Trait acquired, Emberfang bloodline fragment, fire aligned. Technique unlocked, cinder step. He stood over the beast's fallen body in the scorched beast realm dust, chest heaving, forearm marked now with a faint new pattern of orange-red light threading beneath his skin alongside the pale gray mark the bloodstone had judged broken only a day earlier, and understood, with a clarity that felt dangerous to trust too quickly, that whatever he had just survived was not an accident the world would allow him to walk away from unchanged. He returned to the mortal realm before nightfall, the rift closing quietly behind him the way the system explained it would once his mana signature cleared its immediate radius, and spent the ride back to the estate turning the fire threading beneath his skin over in his mind with the same careful, deliberate attention he brought to everything, testing, in small controlled increments once he dismounted and found privacy in his own quarters, exactly what the cinder step technique actually allowed him to do. It answered to his intent in a way his own modest cultivation technique never had, a controlled burst of speed wreathed faintly in ember light, contained and precise rather than the wild, scorching bursts the beast itself had wielded. He asked the system directly, once he'd confirmed the technique's basic shape, what it actually was, not the clipped functional designation it had offered on the hillside, but the fuller truth it had promised only once host stability was confirmed. Host stability confirmed following successful realm contact and integration, the system replied, and for the first time, the text that followed carried more weight than a simple directive. Guardian Directive origin. Constructed as a permanent function embedded within the Devourer bloodline at its founding, designed to guide awakened hosts through realm assimilation without dependence on external mentorship. Historical basis. Prior hosts who developed under direct external guidance were more easily identified, monitored, and ultimately destroyed by external powers threatened by the bloodline's growth. The Guardian Directive exists because no living mentor could be trusted with this bloodline's survival across generations. Only the bloodline's own embedded function could be trusted to outlast the powers that sought to end it. Kael sat with that for a long time in the quiet of his own room, understanding, with a settling cold clarity, that the classification broken had never been a description of what he carried. It had been a containment measure, deliberate and precise, dressed up as an insult so thorough that even his own clan's archives had apparently never questioned it. He did not tell his family. Not yet. He returned instead, over the following days, to the same patient, methodical testing that had gotten him through every discovery of his life so far, deliberately seeking a second rift once the system indicated his integration of the Emberfang fragment had stabilized fully. A fringe connection, this time, to a realm the system identified with a flicker of what almost read like caution in its otherwise flat, functional text, the Abyss realm, colder and considerably more dangerous than the Beast realm's ember-scarred wilds. The lesser Abyss Wraith beast he encountered there fought nothing like the Emberfang had, its violet-black aura carrying a weight that pressed against his chest like physical pressure rather than heat, its technique built around sudden, silent displacement rather than raw aggression, and Kael fought this encounter with considerably more control than the first, the system's guidance sharper now, more specific, warning him half a second before each displacement rather than simply narrating the aftermath. The second devouring, when it came, confirmed what he had begun to suspect since the first, realm assimilation, complete. Trait acquired, Abyss Wraith bloodline fragment, void aligned. Technique unlocked, umbral step. The two fragments did not blend into a single muddied aura the way he might have expected. They sat distinctly beside each other beneath his skin, orange-red and violet-black threading in parallel rather than merging, each retaining its own character, its own technique, its own color, exactly as the system had begun to suggest they would, not a single evolving power, but a growing collection, each realm contributing its own distinct thread to a tapestry that was, unmistakably, becoming something no single mortal realm bloodline had ever produced. He could not keep the changes hidden indefinitely. A cultivator's aura, however carefully controlled, left traces that experienced eyes eventually learned to read, and it was his cousin Sarah who noticed first, catching him in the estate's training courtyard during a quiet early morning session where he'd allowed himself, carelessly, to test Cinderstep's speed against Umbral Step's precision in a way that left faint traces of both auras visible in the dawn light. Kael Vaelric was, by the clan's own quiet consensus, a genuinely capable cultivator whose talent had simply never been enough to matter against the scale of the clan's overall decline, and she watched Kael's controlled, precise movement across the courtyard with an expression that shifted, over the several seconds she stood silently at the courtyard's edge, from simple curiosity into something considerably sharper. "That's not a broken bloodline's technique," she said, once he'd noticed her and gone still. He considered lying, weighed the cost of it against the cost of the truth, and found, standing there in the dawn light with 2 realms worth of borrowed power still humming faintly beneath his skin, that he did not particularly want to lie to her. "No," he said. "It isn't." He told her everything, in the careful, methodical way he told most things, and watched her expression move through disbelief, then something close to wonder, then, finally, a settled, thoughtful calculation that reminded him uncomfortably of the way his grandfather assessed clan politics. "The elders think we're finished," she said, when he'd finished explaining. "They've been quietly preparing for it for years. If what you're describing is real, and if it keeps growing the way you think it will, it changes what finished means," Kael said. She didn't ask him to prove it immediately. She simply watched him with an attention that had not existed in how she looked at him before that morning, and within days, without either of them announcing anything to the wider household, the subtle shift in how she carried herself around him, less careful pity, more genuine curiosity, became the first visible crack in the clan's settled, resigned consensus about its own future. The elders noticed next, more slowly, in the specific way institutions notice things only once the evidence accumulated past the point of easy dismissal. Kael's continued growth, deliberately restrained in public but impossible to fully conceal across weeks of continued realm assimilation, produced a cultivation presence that even the most casual observer among the senior Vaelric cultivators eventually registered as inconsistent with a broken classification, and the quiet, careful repositioning that followed. Elders finding reasons to include him in conversations he'd never been invited to before, his grandfather's formal acknowledgments growing marginally warmer, told Kael everything he needed to know about how quickly a family's resigned certainty could reorganize itself around the return of something it had already grieved. He asked the system, once the clan's shift had become impossible to ignore, why the bloodline had been buried so thoroughly in the first place, and received, finally, the fuller history it had been withholding since that first night in the dark. Historical record, partial reconstruction. The Devourer bloodline's last host prior to current activation achieved sufficient realm assimilation across multiple generations to threaten the ruling clan's established hierarchy directly. Response from ruling powers, coordinated suppression, culminating in the host's death and the deliberate falsification of the bloodline's classification records to prevent recognition in future generations. The designation broken was applied specifically to ensure no future host would be identified, trained, or protected before external powers could act to suppress the bloodline again. Kael read that history standing in the same quiet courtyard where Sarah had first confronted him, and felt the humiliation of the rite reframe itself completely in his memory, not a confirmation of his own inadequacy, but the lingering scar tissue of a suppression campaign old enough that even his own clan's archives had forgotten what they were actually protecting him from. The world beyond the Vaelric estate did not remain unaware for long. A clan's fortunes did not shift quietly on the Nine Realms continent, not when rival houses maintained the kind of careful, ongoing intelligence networks that determined which fading families might be worth reconsidering and which declining names had genuinely reached their floor, and it was barely a month after Sarah's first confrontation in the courtyard that a formal envoy arrived at the Vaelric estate's gate, bearing the banner of the Thal Karas clan, one of the region's genuinely powerful houses, requesting an audience under the polite, carefully worded pretext of discussing a proposed cultivation tournament alliance between their two families. Kael understood, watching the envoy's carriage approach from the estate's upper terrace, that no genuinely powerful clan sent a formal envoy to discuss tournament alliances with a house the entire continent had spent 3 generations quietly writing off. This was reconnaissance, dressed in ceremonial language, and the fact that it had arrived this quickly told him the rumors of a changed Vaelric heir had already traveled considerably further than he'd hoped they would. The origin blessing, silent on the topic of external political danger throughout every stage of his growth so far, offered him a single line of text as the envoy carriage passed through the estate outer gate. Warning. Prior hosts revealed growth prematurely to external observers before establishing sufficient strength to survive the response it invited. Recommend caution regarding disclosure scope. Kael stood on the terrace, watching the Thal Karas banner catch the afternoon light, 2 realms worth of borrowed power settled quiet and controlled beneath his skin, and understood that the careful, patient work of the past month. The private discoveries, Sarah cautious trust, his grandfather slowly warming acknowledgement, had just collided with the exact kind of outside attention the system's ancient design had been built specifically to help him survive. He had no master to advise him through what came next. He had only the Guardian embedded in his own bloodline, a system built by someone, centuries ago, who had understood exactly how this moment would eventually arrive, and had left behind, in place of a living mentor nobody could ultimately be trusted to become, a single warning arriving precisely when it mattered most. He descended from the terrace to meet the envoy calmly, the same deliberate, unhurried composure he had carried since the rite's public humiliation, and understood, walking down toward the gate where his grandfather already waited to receive their guests, that whatever he chose to reveal in the coming conversation would determine not just his own path forward, but whether the Vaelric clan quiet, fragile recovery survived contact with a world that had, once before, decided this exact kind of growth was a danger worth destroying. The Thal Karas envoy carriage came to rest inside the estate outer courtyard with the unhurried precision of people who had arrived somewhere they expected to be received rather than merely admitted, and Kael descended the terrace steps beside his grandfather with the same deliberate composure he had carried through every difficult moment since the rite, understanding that whatever he revealed in the next hour would shape everything that followed it. The envoy introduced himself as Torin Karas, a senior cousin of the Thal Karas clan ruling line, his bearing carrying the specific, unforced confidence of someone whose bloodline had never once required him to question his own standing in the world. He offered the formal courtesies the occasion required. Congratulations on the Vaelric clan recent, renewed vitality, phrased with just enough careful ambiguity that Kael understood immediately it was not a compliment so much as an invitation to reveal how much of the rumor was true. "We've heard interesting things," Torrin said, once the formal greetings concluded and the two parties had settled into the estate's modest receiving hall, about the young heir who returned from this year's rite with a broken classification and has, by several accounts reaching us since, shown considerably more promise than that classification would suggest. He smiled, pleasant and unhurried. "The Thal Karas clan values accurate information above rumor. We thought a friendly gesture might clarify things for both our houses. A sparring exhibition, nothing more, one of our junior cultivators against your heir, purely for tournament preparation purposes, should our proposed alliance move forward." Kael understood, in the half-second before his grandfather could answer on his behalf, exactly what was being asked. This was not an alliance proposal. It was reconnaissance dressed in ceremonial language, precisely as he'd suspected watching the carriage approach from the terrace, and the Origin Blessing's single flickering warning from the moment the banner had passed through the gate settled now into something more specific. Warning: full disclosure at this stage carries significant risk. Recommend controlled demonstration only. He accepted the exhibition before his grandfather could deflect it, because refusing would confirm the rumors as thoroughly as revealing everything would, and a controlled demonstration, calibrated carefully, might satisfy the envoy's curiosity without giving him anything worth reporting back in detail. The match, held in the estate's training courtyard the following morning before Torrin and a small retinue of Thal Karas attendants, went exactly as Kael intended it to. He fought the Thal Karas junior cultivator, a confident, capable young man named Ashen whose own cultivation sat comfortably above what the Vaelric clan's declining reputation should have been able to produce as a rival, using nothing beyond his baseline cultivation technique and the barest fraction of Cinderstep speed, enough to win cleanly and decisively, not enough to reveal that a second, void-aligned trait sat quietly threaded beneath the fire, waiting and used. Ashen lost with visible surprise rather than humiliation, and Torrin's expression, watching the match conclude, carried the specific dissatisfaction of a man who had confirmed something noteworthy had happened without gaining enough information to determine exactly what. "A respectable showing," Torrin said afterward, with the careful neutrality of someone recalibrating his own report before he'd even left the estate. "We'll be in touch regarding the tournament proposal." He did not sound, leaving, like a man who intended to be in touch soon, or warmly, and Kael understood, watching the carriage depart back through the outer gate, that the envoy's uncertainty had bought the Vaelric clan time rather than safety. Sarah found him afterward in the same courtyard, arms crossed, studying him with the sharp, assessing attention that had become familiar since the morning she'd first confronted him about Cinderstep. "You held back on purpose," she said. "It wasn't a question. They'd have reported everything if I hadn't." "They'll report everything eventually anyway," she said. "You just delayed which version of the truth reaches them first." She wasn't wrong, and Kael didn't pretend otherwise, and the two of them stood together in the quiet aftermath of the exhibition understanding, without needing to say it plainly, that the restraint had bought them a runway rather than an escape. The Vaelric elders convened a formal council 3 days later, the first genuine strategic council the clan had held in years that concerned itself with something other than managing an accepted decline, and Kael found himself invited to sit among them for the first time in his life, a seat that would have been unthinkable for a confirmed broken bloodline heir only weeks earlier. His grandfather opened the council not with celebration, but with the same careful, measured caution he'd shown watching the rite's ashen light, proposing that the clan begin quietly testing which of its old rivals and former allies might be willing to reconsider a relationship they had long since written off, without yet revealing the full scope of what had actually changed. Kael listened more than he spoke, understanding that this particular kind of political maneuvering required a patience and social calculation his own strengths ran differently from, and left the council with a renewed sense that the clan's fragile recovery depended as much on careful diplomacy as it did on whatever power continued growing beneath his own skin. That growth did not pause to accommodate the council's caution. The Origin Blessing identified a new rift within the week, this one considerably more distant than the first two, requiring a journey of nearly 2 days to reach, a tier connecting to a realm the system designated the Frost Wraith Reaches, its accompanying warning carrying a weight the previous directives hadn't. Prior contacts involved isolated beasts. Frost Wraith Reaches inhabitants hunt in coordinated packs. Recommend heightened caution. Single-target assimilation strategy insufficient for this environment. He went anyway, alone, as he had each time before, understanding that the system's guidance had never yet steered him wrong even when it steered him into genuine danger, and found, stepping through the rift into a landscape of pale ice fields under a sky the color of old bruises, that the warning had understated the threat rather than exaggerated it. The pack found him within the hour, 5 Frost Wraith beasts moving with a coordinated, silent precision that made the earlier Emberfang and Abyss Wraith encounters feel, in retrospect, almost generous in their simplicity. They surrounded him methodically, cutting off retreat before he'd fully registered the tactic, and Kael understood within the first exchange that fighting this encounter the way he'd fought the previous 2, reactive, isolated, testing one threat at a time, would get him killed considerably faster than either prior rift had threatened to. He chained Cinder Step and Umbral Step together for the first time under real pressure, not because the system had explicitly told him the two techniques could combine, but because the desperate logic of the moment demanded speed and displacement in the same motion. Fire-bright bursts folding into sudden violet-black shifts that let him break the pack's coordinated formation apart one beast at a time rather than facing all 5 simultaneously. The combination surprised him as much as it apparently surprised the pack, an evolution neither the Origin Blessing's prior guidance nor his own deliberate testing had anticipated, born entirely out of necessity rather than design. He isolated the pack's alpha in the fighting's final stretch, driving it away from its remaining packmates through a combination of feints his combined techniques made possible, and the killing strike, when it landed, triggered the third assimilation with the same warm, settling pull he'd felt twice before. Realm assimilation, complete. Trait acquired, Frost Wraith Bloodline Fragment, ice-aligned. Technique unlocked, Glacial Ward. He returned to the mortal realm carrying 3 realms worth of borrowed power beneath his skin now, orange-red and violet-black and pale blue threading in careful parallel, each retaining its own distinct character exactly as the pattern had suggested it would, and understood, examining the new mark in the privacy of his own quarters, that whatever he was building had stopped being a single power and become something closer to an entire arsenal, still growing, still incomplete. Sarah asked him the question that had clearly been building in her for weeks on the evening he returned, watching him study the new ice blue mark with the same careful attention he brought to everything. The system, she said. The Guardian Directive. Does it only recognize you, or could it ever recognize someone else? A second host, or, I don't know what I'm asking exactly. Whether I'm meant to just watch this happen, or whether there's a place in it for someone like me. Kael asked the Origin Blessing directly, and the answer it produced was careful in a way its previous responses hadn't been, guarded rather than simply withheld. Guardian Directive is bound to the Devourer bloodline's primary carrier. Secondary host recognition, undetermined. Insufficient historical precedent to confirm possibility. It wasn't a no. It also wasn't a yes, and Kael watched something complicated move across Sarah's expression as she absorbed an answer that left her role in what was happening genuinely uncertain rather than simply defined, and he understood that this particular unresolved question would need to be revisited, though neither of them had the information yet to resolve it properly. The Frost Wraith expedition did not stay contained to the Vaelric estate's quiet inner circle. A servant with looser loyalty than the clan had assumed carried word of Kael's 2-day absence and subsequent return to a contact within the Thal Karas household, and the message that arrived at the Vaelric gate within the week carried none of Torin's earlier careful courtesy. It was a formal tournament challenge, issued directly rather than proposed as alliance building, worded with just enough ceremonial precision to make refusal costly to the clan's fragile recovering reputation, and specific enough in its terms that Kael understood immediately this was no longer reconnaissance. This was an attempt to force a full, public measurement of exactly what the Vaelric heir had become, in front of an audience the Thal Karas clan controlled. The Origin Blessing, when Kael turned to it that evening with the challenge scroll still unanswered on the table before him, finally gave him the full history it had been withholding in fragments since that first night in the dark. The Devourer bloodline's prior host, the system explained, had not been destroyed suddenly or without warning. The pattern that ended him began exactly the way the current pressure was beginning now. A public challenge, carefully engineered to force a premature demonstration of strength before the host had secured sufficient support to survive the response it would inevitably invite. The host had been discredited first, his growing power reframed by rival houses as unnatural and dangerous rather than earned, isolated gradually from whatever allies his own clan might otherwise have offered, until no one remained willing to publicly defend him when the ruling powers finally moved to eliminate the threat directly. Current situation shares structural similarities to historical precedent, the system noted, with the same flat, careful precision it applied to everything. Recommend the host consider this pattern before responding to the tournament challenge. Kael sat with that warning for a long time, the challenge scroll still unrolled before him, and understood that the difference between his own situation and the prior host's fate might rest entirely on the two things that host had apparently lacked in Kael, through careful, patient work rather than any accident of fortune, had already begun securing. A clan that had stopped merely tolerating his return and had begun actively repositioning itself around it, and a cousin willing to stand beside him rather than simply watch from a safe distance. He brought the challenge to his grandfather and Sarah together the following morning, laying out the system's warning plainly alongside the tournament scroll, and watched the two of them absorb the historical parallel with the same gravity he'd felt reading it himself. If you refuse, his grandfather said slowly, the Thal Karas clan frames it as confirmation that the rumors were empty after all. The clan's recovery stalls before it's truly begun. If I accept and reveal too much, Kael said, I invite exactly the response that ended the last host who let his growth show too clearly, too soon. Then you don't reveal too much, Sarah said. You reveal exactly enough to answer the challenge, on our terms, with the clan standing visibly behind you this time instead of letting you stand alone the way the last host apparently did. She looked at him steadily. That's the difference, isn't it? Not how much power you show. Who's standing beside you when you show it? Kael looked between the two of them, his grandfather's careful, calculating support, still cautious but no longer resigned, and Sarah's steady, deliberate willingness to stand visibly in this fight rather than watch it from the courtyard's edge, and understood, turning the tournament scroll over in his hands, that he had already decided. He would accept the challenge. He would reveal, carefully and on his own terms, a controlled measure of what 3 realms worth of assimilated power had actually built inside him. And unlike the host whose fate the origin blessing had just laid out in careful, unflinching detail, he would walk into that reckoning with people beside him who had already chosen, before the tournament ever began, not to let him stand there alone. The days between accepting the tournament challenge and the event itself passed in a deliberate, methodical preparation that bore little resemblance to the frantic training Kael might have expected of himself only weeks earlier. The 3 of them, Kael, Sarah, and their grandfather, settled into a careful strategic rhythm around the estate's council table, mapping out precisely what the tournament would show the watching world and what it would not. Fire and void together, Sarah said, tracing a finger along the notes she'd been keeping since the Frost Wraith Reaches expedition. That's already been seen once, even restrained. Showing the combination fully at the tournament confirms what Tauren suspects without confirming everything he fears. The ice stays hidden, Kael said. It wasn't a question so much as a decision already reached between them in an earlier conversation, reaffirmed now for their grandfather's benefit. One trait held completely in reserve. If the tournament forces more than I intend to give, I have something left that no one watching has any reason to expect. His grandfather studied the two of them with an expression that had shifted, over the preceding weeks, from the careful, resigned composure of a man managing decline into something Kael hadn't seen directed at him before. A kind of watchful respect that measured his grandson's strategic thinking the way it might once have measured a fellow elder's. Careful, he said, not as caution against the plan, but as simple acknowledgement. That's the right instinct. Show enough to answer the challenge. Never enough to remove all uncertainty. Uncertainty is the only leverage a smaller house has against a larger one. The system, when Kael turned to it in the quiet hours refining his control over the 2 techniques he intended to reveal, proved useful in ways that went beyond simple guidance. Guardian Directive assistance, technique execution refinement available upon request. He requested it, and spent the following days working through Cinder Step and Umbral Step combination under the system precise, patient correction. Not new power, but new precision, the difference between a desperate improvisation born of necessity in the Frost Wraith Reaches and a controlled, deliberate demonstration that would look, to any observer, like mastery rather than survival instinct. Word of the accepted challenge did not stay contained to the Thal Karas clan-owned network for long. The Nine Realms continent cultivation houses maintained relationships built on constant, quiet information exchange, and within days of the formal acceptance, the Vaelric estate began receiving a different kind of visitor than it had grown accustomed to across 3 generations of polite dismissal. Some arrived with genuine, cautious goodwill. Minor houses whose own fortunes had similarly stagnated, testing whether a relationship with a recovering Vaelric clan might prove useful in whatever realignment was clearly beginning. Others arrived with considerably less honest intentions, representatives whose careful questions about Kael's training methods and the exact nature of his awakened ability carried the unmistakable shape of information gathering intended for resale to the Thal Karas clan or one of its allies. Kael's grandfather handled these visits with a diplomatic patience that impressed Kael more than any display of raw strength could have, offering warmth without substance, courtesy without disclosure, the careful social calculation that had apparently kept the Vaelric name alive through 3 generations of decline even without the bloodline strength to back it. Sarah pushed, during this same period, for something Kael hadn't fully anticipated. "I want to enter the preliminary matches myself," she told him, in the same direct tone she'd used the morning she first confronted him in the courtyard. "Not as your cousin standing beside the recovering heir. As a competitor in my own right." She held his gaze steadily. "My talent was always real, Kael.it just never mattered next to the clan's overall decline. If the Vaelric name is going to mean something again, I want it to mean something because of what I can do too, not only because of what you've become." He supported her without hesitation, understanding the specific weight behind the request in a way his own recent transformation made him uniquely positioned to recognize. He asked the origin blessing again, that evening, about the question Sarah had raised weeks earlier and never fully resolved. Whether the Guardian Directive might ever recognize a second host. Recognition parameters, undetermined via bloodline proximity alone, the system offered, its answer carrying a fraction more specificity than its previous response had. Historical precedent suggests recognition may correlate with shared trial rather than shared bloodline. Insufficient data to confirm. It wasn't an answer either of them could act on directly, but it was enough to suggest the question remained genuinely open rather than foreclosed, and Kael related to Sarah with the same careful honesty he'd given every piece of information the system had offered him since that first night in the dark. The tournament grounds, when the Vaelric party finally arrived, exceeded anything Kael had prepared himself to expect from the modest sparring exhibition weeks earlier. The Thal Karas clan had staged the event with the specific scale reserved for occasions meant to be witnessed broadly, multiple participating houses, tiered spectator galleries filled with representatives from clans across the region, ranked tournament officials moving through the grounds with the practiced efficiency of people who oversaw such events regularly. Kael felt the weight of it settle over him the moment their party passed through the outer gate, the specific, familiar tension of walking into a space where his family's name still carried the residue of 3 generations of quiet dismissal, except this time, for the first time in his life, actual witnesses would see whether that dismissal still held. The preliminary matches began the following morning, and Sarah's early rounds produced the first genuine surprise of the tournament, her technique sharp and controlled in a way that drew visible attention from spectators who had clearly expected nothing notable from a Vaelric competitor regardless of the recent rumors surrounding her cousin. She won cleanly, twice, and Kael watched her walk off the sparring platform after her second victory with an expression that carried none of the careful restraint she'd shown in every prior conversation about her own overlooked talent, open, unguarded pride, earned entirely on her own terms. His own preliminary rounds proceeded exactly as the careful weeks of preparation had intended. He advanced through his early opponents using only the controlled combination of fire and void techniques, precise and economical, enough to win decisively without revealing anything close to the full scope of what 3 realms worth of assimilated power had built inside him. The watching officials noted his advancement with the specific, measured curiosity that suggested the rumors reaching them had been taken seriously without yet being confirmed, exactly the position Kael and his grandfather had strategized to maintain for as long as possible. The rematch against Ashen arrived in the tournament's third round, and Kael understood, watching the Thal Karas Jr. cultivator take his position across the sparring platform, that this match would not proceed as easily as the preliminaries had. Ashen's stance carried none of the confident carelessness from their first encounter. He had trained specifically, visibly, in the weeks since his exhibition loss, his technique reshaped around defenses clearly designed to counter exactly the combination of speed and displacement Kael had shown him before. The match opened with an intensity the preliminaries hadn't required, Ashen pressing an aggressive, calculated offense that forced Kael to abandon the careful, restrained playbook he'd rehearsed for weeks and adapt in real time, exactly the kind of pressure his grandfather had warned might eventually arrive. He found himself pushed backward across the platform in a way that echoed uncomfortably the desperate opening minutes of the Frost Wraith Reaches encounter, Ashen's counters anticipating Cinder Steps bursts and Umbral Steps displacements with a precision that told Kael his opponent had studied every detail of the earlier exhibition with considerably more care than Kael had assumed. The decisive exchange arrived faster than he wanted it to, Ashen's technique closing a gap Kael's combined fire and void approach couldn't quite answer in time, and in the narrow margin between a strike that would have ended the match in Ashen's favor and whatever response Kael could produce, the pale blue Frost Wraith trait he'd intended to keep fully in reserve surfaced on its own, instinct overriding careful strategic restraint the same way raw survival had overridden calculation in the Beast Realm months earlier. Glacial Ward answered the strike with a controlled, precise wall of isoline defense that stopped Ashen's technique cold, and the match ended moments later with Kael's victory secured, but the victory carried a cost the careful preparation had specifically tried to avoid. The tournament grounds had just watched him reveal a third distinct bloodline trait, unmistakably confirming that whatever rumors had circulated about the Vaelric heir's recovery had not only been true, but had understated the scope of what he'd actually become. The crowd's reaction, in the moments following the match's conclusion, carried none of the polite, distant contempt that had greeted him at the Rite months earlier. What moved through the spectator galleries instead was a charged, uncertain mixture of genuine awe and something considerably closer to alarm, clan representatives exchanging low, urgent conversations, calculations visibly running behind dozens of watching eyes. Kael found Torin Karas's expression in the crowd and watched it shift, in real time, from the smug, probing curiosity he'd carried into the earlier exhibition match into something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine concern. It was not concern that stayed contained to the Thal Karas clan's own private calculations. Word of the reveal traveled through the tournament grounds with the same rapid efficiency that had carried the original rumors of a changed Vaelric heir weeks earlier, and it reached, within the day, an audience considerably more consequential than any single rival clan. A formal representative of the Regional Cultivation Authority arrived at the tournament grounds the following morning, an institution Kael's own family archives had described only in passing as the body responsible for monitoring bloodlines the continent's ruling powers considered historically significant enough to require oversight. Precisely the kind of authority, he understood immediately, watching the representative's formal entrance draw the attention of every clan present, that the Origin Blessing's warnings about the prior host's fate had been quietly preparing him to eventually face. The pattern the system had described weeks earlier, public discreditation, gradual isolation from clan support, elimination once no one remained willing to defend the host publicly, began to assert itself in the representative's carefully formal opening statements, questions about the Devourer bloodline's classification history, about the legitimacy of a broken designation being publicly contradicted, about whether the Vaelric clan's leadership had known and concealed the truth of what they harbored. Kael understood, standing before the representative's formal inquiry with the tournament ground's full attention settled on him, that this was the exact moment the prior host had apparently faced alone, isolated from support until no one remained willing to speak in his defense. His grandfather stepped forward before Kael could formulate his own response, a deliberate, public act that carried none of the careful, background diplomacy he'd shown managing visitors at the estate in the preceding weeks. That I vouch for my grandson, conduct, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the tournament grounds, addressed directly to the regional authority representative and, by extension, to every watching clan present. The Vaelric clan stands behind him fully, in this inquiry and in whatever follows it. Whatever classification error occurred generations ago is not his failing to answer for, and it will not be answered for in isolation. It was, Kael understood, watching his grandfather hold the representative's gaze without flinching, the exact reversal of everything the Rite, opening humiliation had established months earlier. An elder who had once quietly acknowledged his grandson's public failure with a resigned, formal nod now standing publicly, deliberately, in his defense. The origin blessing text arrived at the edge of Kael's vision that evening, once the tournament grounds had finally quieted and the regional authority representative had departed with a formal notice of inquiry rather than any immediate action, carrying an urgency the system, previous, carefully measured directives hadn't shown. Suppression pattern now formally initiated. Historical precedent indicates limited window before regional authority moves from inquiry to direct intervention. Host must determine response, compliance with formal inquiry process, or resistance to authority jurisdiction entirely. Recommend decision before authority. Next formal contact. Kael stood in the quiet aftermath of the tournament chaos, his grandfather public defense and Sarah's steady presence still fresh evidence that he did not face this moment the way the prior host apparently had, and understood that the careful, patient work of the past months had brought him to the exact crossroads the ancient guardian system embedded in his bloodline had always known was coming. The choice no longer whether to reveal what he carried, but what to do now that the world's oldest, most dangerous institution had finally noticed it. The council table in the Vaelric estate's private study had, across the preceding months, become the place where the family's fate was actually decided rather than merely announced, and it was there that Kael, his grandfather, and Sarah gathered the morning after the tournament's chaos to weigh the choice the origin blessing had laid before them with such uncharacteristic urgency. Compliance seems obvious on its surface, his grandfather said, turning the formal notice of inquiry over in his hands with the same careful attention he gave every document that might reshape the clan's future. But the prior host's fate, by the system's own account, unfolded through exactly this kind of compliance. Gradual erosion. Isolation dressed as procedure. If we simply submit to whatever process the authority prescribes, we may be walking the same path at a slower pace rather than a different one. An open resistance, Sarah said, paints us as defiant of continental law before we have the strength to survive being labeled that way. The Vaelric name barely survived 3 generations of quiet dismissal. It won't survive being called an outlaw house. Kael listened to both positions and understood neither offered what he actually needed, which was not a choice between 2 paths the system had already warned him were both dangerous, but a third option neither the authority nor the prior host's history had apparently considered. Then we don't choose between their 2 paths, he said. We find our own. The search for that third option began with Sarah, 3 days later, uncovering something none of them had expected to exist at all. She had gone looking in the estate's family archive for any precedent, however faint, of a Vaelric ancestor navigating regional authority scrutiny successfully, and found instead, behind a section of shelving that had clearly been sealed rather than simply neglected, a hidden compartment containing records that predated even their grandfather's earliest memory of the archive's contents. He didn't know this was here, Sarah said, when she brought Kael down to see it, gesturing at the dust undisturbed for what looked like generations. Nobody currently living knew this was here. The sealed records, once the 3 of them worked through them carefully over the following days, told a story considerably more detailed than the origin blessing's spare, functional summaries had offered. Someone within the Vaelric line, generations after the last Devourer host's destruction, had apparently understood enough of the true history to attempt preserving it, hiding testimony, correspondence, and fragments of the original falsified classification proceedings deep enough that even the family's own institutional memory had eventually lost track of their existence. It was not a complete account. But it was evidence, physical and specific, of exactly the kind the regional authority's own historical record did not include, because the regional authority's own historical record was, according to what the hidden archive suggested, the very institution that had falsified it in the first place. The path forward began to take shape around that discovery, though it required an unexpected ally to become fully viable. The contact arrived discreetly, a minor regional authority official named Corin Vess who requested a private audience with the Vaelric household under a pretext vague enough to avoid drawing attention, and who revealed, once safely inside the estate's walls, a disillusionment with his own institution that had clearly been building for considerably longer than the current inquiry. "I've reviewed cases like this before," Corin said, his voice low even in the privacy of the study. "Not this exact bloodline, but the pattern. The authority doesn't always move toward destruction because the evidence demands it. Sometimes it moves because the precedent of a falsified record, once questioned, threatens the authority's own legitimacy more than it threatens continental safety." He looked at Kael directly. "I can't change the inquiry's course myself. But there's a narrow procedural path, a formal hearing rather than an administrative ruling. That would let you present evidence directly rather than simply submit to whatever conclusion gets reached without your input. It's slower. It's also the only version of this process where you have any real voice in the outcome." It was, Kael understood immediately, the third option they'd been searching for. Not full compliance, not open resistance, but a calculated middle path that used the authority's own procedures against the pattern the system had warned him about, controlling exactly what evidence reached the hearing rather than letting the inquiry define the narrative on its own terms. They chose it deliberately, in the days that followed, building their case around the hidden archives fragments with the same careful, patient method Kael had applied to every discovery since the night the Origin Blessing first spoke to him in the dark. The formal hearing convened 3 weeks later, in a chamber considerably more austere than the tournament grounds' public spectacle had been, 3 regional authority representatives seated before Kael's small party with an air of institutional weight that made the room feel colder than its actual temperature warranted. The questioning began carefully, probing not merely the scope of his power but the shape of his intentions, testing, in the specific way Corin had warned them it would, whether Kael represented the same threat to established hierarchy the last Devourer host had apparently been judged to embody. Kael answered each question with the same measured honesty he'd given the Origin Blessing itself since that first uncertain night, neither minimizing what he'd become nor performing a humility he didn't feel, and it was his grandfather's testimony, when the hearing's second day arrived, that shifted the proceedings' entire weight. He presented the sealed archives evidence methodically, laying out fragment after fragment of testimony and correspondence that painted a picture the authority's own official record did not contain, a picture of a bloodline deliberately mislabeled generations ago not because it was naturally weak, but because it had once grown strong enough to threaten the ruling powers of its era, and had been buried rather than honestly assessed. "You are asking my grandson to answer for a threat," he said, his voice carrying the same clear, unwavering conviction he'd shown publicly defending Kael at the tournament grounds weeks earlier, that your own institution's predecessors manufactured through falsification rather than discovered through honest inquiry. I am asking this hearing to consider which of those 2 histories it intends to continue. The chamber's response was not immediate agreement. But something shifted in the representatives' careful, guarded expressions, a crack Corin's earlier warning had prepared them to look for, not unanimous conviction, but genuine disagreement among the 3 officials themselves, one visibly troubled by the implications of a falsified historical record, another clearly more concerned with precedent and institutional stability than with the specific truth of what had happened generations ago. It was the first real division within the authority's own ranks that Kael's side could work with rather than simply push against, and Corin, watching from his own careful distance in the gallery, offered the faintest, private confirmation that the disagreement was exactly what he'd hoped their evidence might produce. The Thal Karas clan did not remain passive while the hearing's outcome hung uncertain. Sensing the authorities' hesitation as an opportunity rather than a resolution, Torin Karas submitted a formal proposal of his own during the hearing's brief recess, that the Thal Karas clan be formally designated the Devourer bloodline's responsible overseer, positioned to monitor and guide Kael's continued development under the framing of institutional safety, a bid transparent enough in its actual intent that Kael understood immediately what it represented. Not protection, but control, dressed in exactly the same careful institutional language the ancient suppression campaign had once used to justify destroying the bloodline entirely. His grandfather rejected the proposal formally and immediately, and the authority representatives, still divided among themselves, did not act on it either, leaving it suspended alongside the hearing's still unresolved central question. It was in the middle of that mounting pressure, during a quiet evening between the hearing sessions, that Sarah's own trial arrived, unplanned and unprovoked by anyone's deliberate design. A minor skirmish broke out near the hearing ground's outer perimeter, agitators loosely connected to factions unhappy with the proceedings' direction, and Sarah, first to respond, found herself facing genuine danger without Kael present to intervene. She fought it alone, the same desperate necessity that had once driven Kael's first strike against the Emberfang beast now driving her own decisive action, and in the moment her own survival hung in the balance, Kael felt something shift through his connection to the origin blessing, a presence extending outward in a way it never had before. Shared trial condition met, the system informed him, once the skirmish had ended and Sarah stood, breathing hard but unharmed, in its aftermath. Secondary host recognition, partial. Guardian Directive extending limited connection to designated ally. Sarah felt it too, he understood, watching her expression shift from adrenaline into something closer to disbelief as she registered whatever faint new awareness had settled into her own perception. She was not a second Devourer host in the full sense the bloodline itself required. But she was, for the first time since the courtyard morning she'd first confronted him, formally recognized by the system as something more than support standing at the edge of his growth, a partner, however limited, in whatever came next. The hearing concluded 4 days later, the regional authorities' 3 representatives delivering a ruling that satisfied no single party completely but ended the immediate threat that had hung over the Vaelric clan since the tournament's chaos. Not full exoneration, the authority stopped short of formally acknowledging its own predecessor's falsification as established fact, unwilling to fully undermine its own historical legitimacy. But a conditional recognition of the Vaelric account, sufficient to avoid the destructive suppression pattern the prior host had suffered, paired with a formal designation placing Kael under long-term observation rather than immediate intervention. It was, Kael understood, walking out of the hearing chamber with his grandfather and Sarah beside him, neither victory nor defeat, but survival on terms the prior host had never been given the chance to negotiate, a compromise that closed one danger while leaving others, Thal Karasa's rejected but not abandoned ambitions among them, quietly unresolved and waiting for whatever came next. The observer arrived every 2 weeks, always at a different time of day, always with the same careful, unhurried politeness that Kael had come to understand as its own kind of pressure rather than genuine courtesy. Her name was Administrator Wex, a mid-ranking regional authority official assigned specifically to the Vaelric case, and her visits followed a pattern precise enough that Kael suspected the precision itself was deliberate. A reminder, delivered gently and repeatedly, that his freedom remained conditional rather than restored. Routine assessment, Wex said each time, reviewing whatever notes she'd compiled since her last visit, asking careful, measured questions about his training, his travel, any unusual activity the household might wish to report. She was not unkind. She was also, unmistakably, watching, and the estate's quiet daily rhythms had reorganized themselves around her visits the way a household reorganized itself around any regular intrusion it could not refuse. "It's not freedom," Sarah said, one evening after Wex's departure, watching Kael stand at the study window with the particular stillness he adopted when turning something difficult over in his mind. "It's freedom on loan. And loans get called in." She was not wrong, and Kael did not pretend otherwise, though the observation status had at least given them something the hearing's chaos hadn't allowed, time to understand what her own partial connection to the origin blessing actually meant in practice. They tested it carefully over the following weeks, in the estate's quiet training courtyard, Sarah reaching for whatever faint awareness the system had extended to her during the skirmish outside the hearing grounds. It answered in fragments. A dim, resonant sense of realm rifts when she stood near one, nothing like the detailed guidance Kael received but enough that she could sense the general direction and rough danger level of a tier before either of them approached it. A faint resonance, too, with the traits Kael had already assimilated, something closer to recognition than power. She could feel, standing close to him during training, the shape of the ember fire and void dark and ice pale threads beneath his skin, though she could not draw on them herself. Not a second host, Kael said, watching her concentration as she reached for the sensation again. But not nothing, either. No, she agreed. Not nothing. The quiet, careful progress of those weeks did not go unmatched by equally careful movement elsewhere. Torin Karas, having failed to secure formal oversight of the Devourer bloodline through the authorities' ruling, had not abandoned the ambition so much as redirected it, and word reached the Vaelric estate slowly, through the same network of visiting minor houses that had once carried rumors of Kael's recovery, that the Thal Karas clan was quietly courting allies among the region's other established families. The framing, when it filtered back to them secondhand, was careful and reasonable sounding in exactly the way institutional maneuvering always was, not an accusation, but a concern, dressed in language about collective regional safety and the risks of an unmonitored, still-growing bloodline whose full scope remained uncertain even to the authority that had ruled on it. "He's building a coalition," Kael's grandfather said, turning the reports over with the same weary, calculating attention he gave every threat to the clan's fragile recovery. "One clan questioning the ruling is noise. For clans petitioning together is pressure the authority can't as easily dismiss." It was against this backdrop of careful, mounting political maneuvering that the Origin Blessing identified a new rift, its accompanying directive carrying a caution sharper than any it had offered before, new realm contact available. Designation, Sundered Expanse. Warning, instability and danger level exceed all prior contacts significantly. Additional warning, current observation status increases consequence of any incident during this expedition. Recommend deferral pending resolution of external political pressure. Kael read the warning twice, understanding fully what it was telling him, and weighed it against a different calculation entirely, that deferring every expedition until the political pressure resolved meant accepting stagnation exactly when Thal Karas's coalition was working to frame him as dangerously unmonitored, an irony that struck him as its own kind of trap. Growth carried risk. So did standing still while rivals built a case against him. "I'm going," he told Sarah and his grandfather, laying out the system's warning plainly rather than concealing it the way he might once have. But not alone this time. Sarah didn't wait to be asked. "I'm coming." His grandfather's objection, when it came, carried less resistance than Kael expected, worn down perhaps by months of watching his grandson's judgment prove sound in circumstances that had, each time, looked reckless from the outside and deliberate from within. "Then you go carefully," he said. "And you come back before Wexa's next visit, or her routine assessment stops being routine." They entered the Sundered Expanse 3 days later, and the realm announced its danger before either of them had taken 20 steps past the rift's shimmering boundary. The terrain itself defied the ordered patterns of the previous 3 realms, fractured ground that shifted underfoot in ways that suggested the very physics of the space remained unsettled, colors bleeding across the horizon in combinations that had no name in either of their cultivation vocabularies. The beasts that found them, when they came, carried bloodlines that resisted simple classification entirely, auras that flickered between elemental signatures rather than holding to one, as though something in this realm's fundamental structure refused the ordered categories that governed the beast realm, the abyss, and the Frost Wraith Reaches alike. Sarah's partial connection proved crucial faster than either of them anticipated, a faint, urgent pulse of warning reaching her half a second before a fractured, shifting beast lunged from ground that had, moments earlier, looked stable. "Left," she called, and Kael moved before his own senses had fully registered the threat, the combined speed of Cinder Step and Umbral Step carrying him clear of a strike that would have caught him flat-footed without her warning. They fought together through the Expanse's opening hours in a rhythm that hadn't existed in any of Kael's prior solo expeditions, Sarah's early warning sense buying him the margin his own combat instincts needed to answer each unpredictable threat, and it was in the deepest stretch of the fractured terrain, cornered by something that resembled no single beast so much as a fusion of forms that shouldn't have coexisted, that Kael found the opening for a 4th devouring. The strike, when it landed, produced a sensation unlike the 3 assimilations before it, not the clean, settling warmth of a new trait threading alongside its predecessors, but something more turbulent, unstable, resisting integration the way the beast itself had resisted simple classification. Realm assimilation, partial. Trait acquired, sundered fragment, unstable, element undetermined. Warning, integration requires gradual, deliberate stabilization. Immediate use not recommended. He carried the new mark back through the rift 3 days later exactly as the system had cautioned, unstable and only partially settled, a fourth thread beneath his skin that pulsed with a shifting, uncertain color neither fire nor void nor ice, and understood, examining it in the privacy of his own quarters once they'd returned, that whatever deeper realms lay beyond the sundered expanse's boundary produced power considerably less orderly than anything he'd assimilated before. The political consequences of the expedition arrived faster than either of them had prepared for. Word reached the Vaelric estate within the week that the Thal Karas-led coalition had grown to include 3 additional regional clans, and their formal petition to the regional authority now cited, with a specificity that could only have come from another informant inside the estate's own household, the Sundered Expanse expedition directly. Evidence, the petition argued, that the Vaelric heir's growth had escalated beyond anything the original ruling's observation framework had anticipated, and that collective oversight was no longer merely prudent but urgently necessary. Someone told them, Sarah said, her expression darkening as she read the petition's language. Not rumor this time. Detail. Corin Vess confirmed it directly, arriving at the estate under the same careful discretion he'd used before, though his warning this time carried less of the cautious optimism he'd offered at the earlier hearing. The coalition's petition has genuine traction, he said. The division that saved you last time has narrowed considerably. Several officials who were sympathetic to your account are now leaning toward reopening the case, not because they've changed their minds about the falsified history, but because the political pressure of 4 clans petitioning together is difficult for the authority to simply dismiss without appearing to favor a single house over collective regional concern. Kael listened to the warning with the same careful, methodical attention he brought to every piece of difficult information, and understood, turning it over alongside his grandfather and Sarah in the study that evening, that waiting for the authority to act on the coalition's petition meant surrendering the same initiative that had won them the earlier hearing's favorable compromise. We don't wait for them to force another hearing, Kael said finally. We request one ourselves. A voluntary review of my development, on our terms, framed as transparency rather than concession. He looked between his grandfather's measured consideration and Sarah's steady, resolved attention. If Thal Karas wants to prove I'm unmonitored and dangerous, we take that argument away from them before they finish building it. We show the authority exactly what the Sundered Expanse produced, on our own terms, before the coalition's version of events becomes the only one anyone's heard. His grandfather considered it for a long moment, and Kael watched the same careful calculation move behind his eyes that had once weighed nothing but managed decline and now weighed genuine strategy. Bold, he said finally. And it's the only version of this fight where we choose the ground it's fought on, instead of simply defending whatever ground Thal Karas picks for us. Sarah's answer was simpler. Then let's choose it. The formal request reached the regional authority's central registry 2 days after Kael's decision, filed with a deliberate speed his grandfather insisted on, understanding that timing itself carried strategic weight. Every day we wait, he'd said, reviewing the document's careful language before it was sent, is another day Thal Karas's coalition grows larger and their narrative grows more settled in the authority's collective mind. We move now, while their petition is still just a petition and ours can arrive first. The effect, when reports filtered back through Corin Vess's careful discretion, was exactly what they'd hoped for. The coalition's formal complaint, still being refined and expanded when the news broke that the Vaelric heir had voluntarily requested his own comprehensive review, suddenly looked less like a necessary intervention and more like an aggressive maneuver overtaken by the very transparency it claimed to be demanding. They're scrambling, Corin reported, arriving at the estate with something almost like satisfaction in his usually careful, neutral tone. Torin's allies are asking why they should escalate a petition against someone who's already opened his own development to formal scrutiny. It's not fatal to their case. But it's no longer the clean, obvious argument it was a week ago. The victory of timing bought them room, but not comfort, because the review itself would require Kael to present something he had not yet finished understanding himself. The fourth trait, still unstable, still resisting the clean integration the previous 3 had eventually settled into. He turned to the system in the quiet hours before the review's scheduled date, working through the sundered fragment stabilization with the same patient discipline that had carried him through every prior discovery. Integration proceeding within safe parameters, the Origin Blessing reported, though its guidance carried a caution the previous 3 assimilations hadn't required. Rushing stabilization for external timeline reasons increases risk of destabilizing prior integrated traits. Recommend continued gradual approach regardless of review date. It was not the answer the looming deadline wanted, and Kael accepted it anyway, understanding that whatever pressure the political timeline exerted, the actual cost of forcing the fragment's integration too quickly would be paid in his own body, not in some abstract procedural sense the authorities' schedule could be made to accommodate. He worked the fragment carefully instead, small deliberate exposures under controlled conditions, watching its shifting, undefined color slowly settle into something closer to a stable thread rather than a volatile one, though it remained, even by the review's arrival, considerably less refined than the Ember Fire, Void Dark, and Ice Pale traits that had preceded it. Administrator Wex's role shifted unexpectedly in the days leading up to the review, her routine bi-weekly visits replaced by a formal notice naming her to a preparatory advisory position within the review panel supporting staff. Kael noticed the change in her manner immediately during her next visit, something in her careful, measured questions carrying a different quality than the detached procedural curiosity she'd shown across months of routine assessments. "You've been thorough," she said, reviewing the documentation his grandfather had prepared for the formal review, her tone not warm exactly, but genuinely engaged in a way it hadn't been before. "Most cases I've observed in this role involve subjects who resist disclosure, who make my job about extracting information rather than receiving it. This is different." She looked at him with an attention that felt, for the first time since her assignment to the case, like actual curiosity rather than institutional obligation. "I've watched your development directly, more closely than the coalition members pushing their petition ever have. Whatever the panel decides, I intend to speak to what I've actually observed." It was not a promise of favorable testimony, but it was, Kael understood, the first genuine crack in the authorities' institutional distance since Corin Vess's initial quiet warning months earlier, and he found himself grateful for it in a way that surprised him with its intensity. The coalition, sensing their advantage slipping as news of Wex's engaged preparation and the review's approaching date spread through the region's clan network, moved to discredit the process before it could even begin. Torin Karas submitted a formal objection arguing that a review staged entirely on the Vaelric clan's own initiative, presented through evidence the family itself controlled and curated, could not be trusted as genuinely independent. Pushing instead for a panel selected in equal part by the coalition's own nominated representatives, ensuring, in his careful phrasing, a truly balanced assessment rather than a performance staged for a predetermined conclusion. The authority, weighing the competing pressures of a coalition too large to dismiss and a voluntary transparency too significant to undermine without appearing to punish honesty, split the difference in exactly the way Kael's grandfather had privately predicted they might. The review panel would include both the officials who had shown genuine sympathy toward the Vaelric account during the earlier hearing, and members nominated by the coalition itself, a compromise that satisfied neither side completely and left the review's actual outcome resting, as his grandfather observed grimly, entirely on the strength of evidence and composure rather than any procedural advantage either side might have hoped to claim. "This was always going to come down to what we show them," he said, the night before the review, "not how the panel was assembled. We knew that from the beginning. Nothing has changed except that now it's official." The review convened in a chamber similar to the one that had hosted the earlier hearing, though the atmosphere carried a different weight, less the tension of an institution deciding whether to believe an accused party and more the careful, deliberate scrutiny of a body genuinely trying to reach an informed judgment from a wider range of competing interests. Kael presented his development with the full transparency he and his grandfather had committed to, laying out each of the 4 assimilated traits in sequence, the Ember Fire technique from the Beast Realm, the Void Dark displacement from the Abyss, the Ice Pale defense from the Frost Wraith Reaches, and finally the still settling, still imperfect 4th fragment from the Sundered Expanse, presented honestly as unfinished rather than concealed as though it were already fully mastered. He laid the sealed archives evidence before the panel again, the same falsified classification history that had shifted the earlier hearing's outcome, and watched the coalition-nominated members study it with a skepticism considerably harder to read than the sympathetic official's more open engagement. Sarah's testimony followed his own, and Kael watched her speak with the same steady, unguarded conviction she'd shown since the courtyard morning she'd first confronted him about Cinderstep. She described the shared trial that had triggered her partial connection to the Guardian Directive not as an accident or an anomaly, but as evidence of exactly the kind of accountability the coalition's petition claimed was absent, a bloodline's growth that had, rather than isolating its host, drawn genuine bonds of trust and shared risk around him. This isn't a solitary, uncontrolled threat, she told the panel directly. I've stood beside him through 2 realm expeditions. I've felt, through whatever connection the system extended to me, exactly how carefully he approaches every stage of what he's becoming. If this bloodline were the danger the coalition frames it as, I wouldn't be standing here defending it. I'd be the first person warning you against it. It was Torin Karas's own testimony, called to formally articulate the coalition's continued concerns despite the transparency just presented, that produced the review's decisive turn. Pressed by one of the sympathetic panel members to explain precisely what additional oversight the coalition believed necessary given the full disclosure they had just witnessed, Torin's careful, measured composure slipped in a way that revealed more than his prepared statements had intended. The Thal Karas clan remains prepared to formally assume responsible oversight of the bloodline's continued development, he said, should the panel determine that current arrangements prove insufficient. You're proposing yourselves again, the panel member interrupted, her tone carrying a sharpness that hadn't been present in her earlier questions. Despite that proposal already having been formally rejected once. Is the coalition's concern genuinely about regional safety, Representative Karas, or is it about which house ultimately controls access to what this bloodline can become? Torin did not have a ready answer for that question, and the silence that followed told the chamber everything his careful institutional language had been working to obscure since the tournament ground's original exhibition match months earlier. The panel's deliberation took 2 days, and when the ruling finally came, it exceeded even the cautious optimism Kael's grandfather had allowed himself to privately hope for. Not merely a continuation of the original conditional status, but a formal reduction in observation frequency, the panel's written decision citing the transparency of the voluntary review, the corroborating evidence of the sealed archive, and in language that Corin Vess later confirmed had been added specifically by the previously sympathetic officials, a formal note expressing the panel's concern regarding the coalition's demonstrated interest in oversight authority disproportionate to the stated safety concerns. Word of the ruling spread through the region's clan network with the same speed that had once carried rumors of a broken bloodline's public humiliation, and Kael understood, standing in the Vaelric estate's courtyard as his grandfather read the formal decision aloud to the assembled household, that the outcome represented something considerably larger than a single favorable ruling. The coalition Torin had spent months carefully assembling was fracturing publicly, its central architect's own ambitions exposed before the very institution he'd hoped to use against them, and the Vaelric name, spoken once with nothing but pity across the ceremonial grounds of a rite that felt, now, like it belonged to a different lifetime entirely, was being spoken instead with something that had not attached itself to the family in 3 full generations. Genuine respect, earned rather than remembered. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Anime Void for more amazing anime and manhwa recaps. What did you think about this video? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your opinions.